Hi everyone, welcome to this webinar hosted by Jay Scrambler, in which we're going to explore some lessons learned from securing 2 billion e-commerce end user sessions. I'm going to start by letting you know that this webinar has been pre-recorded, so if you have any questions, you can reach out to us via email and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. My name is Don Duncan, and I'm the Director of Sales Engineering and Eastern North America and Canada at Jay Scrambler. This mix of e-commerce and security we'll be talking about today really hits home, as throughout the years I've been involved in this space in companies like HP, MasterCard, and Shape Security. I also want to present our colleague Felipe Pereira, who is the head of engineering at Jay Scrambler and has an outstanding depth of understanding and insight into the data that he's going to be presenting today. On to the next big item on the menu today. Our main focus for the session will be to go through the current state of application security in e-commerce, specifically looking at some first-hand data collected by Jay Scrambler. This data will be the centerpiece of our webinar, since it will provide an outlook into how e-commerce websites are able to defend themselves against real-world threats. With these statistics, we're going to be able to go over very interesting insights that we've gathered while monitoring and securing this huge volume of consumer sessions in e-commerce websites. All the more reason to stick with us, as today we will hopefully leave you at the end with some highly relevant new information that you can use to help with some of your own business and security challenges. At the end of the webinar, we're going to have some time to answer your questions. You can write your questions throughout the webinar on the chat box, and we're going to be addressing those at the end. Let's get a move on. We'll jump right into the couple of slides here that will help us frame the current state of the e-commerce industry and how security has a critical role to play. I think it would be an understatement to say that e-commerce has grown during the last couple of years. What we have actually witnessed was an unprecedented explosion of revenue fueled by during the pandemic. This sent some shockwaves, especially in the markets. In the words of Gartner analysts, e-commerce will be the most critical route to market for organizations worldwide in the next 2 years. These high-level statistics here from the 2021 Digital Economy Index by Adobe really paint the picture of the market right now. 39% year-on-year growth in Q1 2021, with global spending growing to $4.2 trillion in 2021. Wherever you look, it seems like it's unanimous that this is not a short-term trend. A good chunk of customers have permanently changed their purchasing habits and are expected to continue with an e-commerce first shopping experience. A metric from the report that I found especially interesting is this last one. Almost 2/3 of the revenue growth in 2021 originated from an uplift in global web traffic. We're essentially talking about a web-based platform having to accommodate 64% more traffic volume inside the span of a few months. With all the technical and supply challenges that underpin this data, there's yet another behemoth that retailers have to deal with, and that is cybersecurity. Whether it's valuable information or data being exchanged on the web, you'll find hordes of cyber criminals trying to get a slice of the pie. The explosive growth in e-commerce has created the optimal grounds for an absolute data feeding frenzy. Looking at 2021 data for cyber attacks and data breaches, we find that when we consider the universe of data breaches that originated from a hacking action, over 90% have involved a web application attack vector. It's no surprise here, since we're talking about websites that are experiencing a strong uplift in consumer traffic as well as pressure to innovate at a very fast pace. If you work in cybersecurity, you know these two ingredients often lead to security flaws. When you have a system that's constantly handling a huge volume of sensitive data, including PII, payment card information, there's a significant risk that attackers might be able to access and exfiltrate this data. The statistics for 2021 back up this grim scenario, with 44% of breaches including PII records. With data protection regulations becoming increasingly widespread and tightening their grips on organizations, data breaches lead to significant legal damages and repercussions. All thoughts considered, I think it's fair to say that we're looking at a breach market of sorts, where cyber criminals are thriving as companies still lag behind it when it comes to security. This leads us to probably one of the biggest challenges that organizations face right now. As McKinsey puts it, they have to strike a delicate balance between securing their digital channels against a growing wave of cyber attacks, while at the same time ensuring that this does not disrupt the end user experience. Solving this clash of two different realities is definitely feasible, but it's an undertaking that requires a company wide commitment and the eyes and minds of several different teams working together towards the same goal. For more on that, I'm going to move things over to Felipe, who will walk us through some specifics of these security challenges and present our findings. Thanks, Felipe, and feel free to take it over from here.
Thank you, Don. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. So, as Don mentioned before, I'm the head of engineering at JScrambler, and I've worked very closely with several companies in helping them address the security issues we're exploring today. I want to start by giving an overview of why websites often lack the security controls to prevent data leakage attacks. Well, the first thing we need to understand is the anatomy of the average modern website. So when we look at the sum of the most recent stats, we see that around more or less 70% of the scripts running on the average website come from third parties. In other words, only 30% of the website's code is written and maintained internally by the company. On the right side of the screen here, I have a simple illustration portraying a typical website that is using some of the most common types of third-party scripts. So we have things like a video player, analytical tools, form validation, and even a live chat widget. This roughly is around 35 different third-party components and 31 fourth-party components, which obviously creates a very complicated supply chain, as you can imagine. And the key word here is really supply chain. I think it's likely that every one of us recalls the SolarWinds and Log4j attacks, both of which are prime examples of massive software supply chain attacks with global proportions. What happens on the web is quite similar. We have a series of website modules that are sourced by third parties. Companies have no direct control over these modules, but if an attacker manages to inject malicious code into a module, the code will automatically start running on the website and can lead to a data breach. The supply chain gets so complex that it ends up creating a massive security blind spot. The underlying issue here is that most commonly used security measures like web application firewalls aren't capable of preventing these attacks. As you can tell by looking at this illustration, these web-based attacks don't involve any request at all to the server side of the affected company. Attackers can monitor form submission, for example, collect the data that is inserted into the form, and leak the data to their own drop server, and all directly through the client side. So no need to go through the server side. So if that happens, of course, a firewall cannot detect these kind of attacks and can prevent the browser from sending data to an attacker's endpoint. We actually did a webinar a few months ago where we went through the specifics of these attacks and how different security approaches deal with them, but today I won't go into that level of depth. My main point here is that the same supply chains that allow for complexity of modern e-commerce websites end up posing a significant security liability, and they can be exploited, of course, by cyber criminals, and companies often lack the security controls to prevent these attacks. And this leads me to our findings, to all the data and insights we have obtained after monitoring and protecting over 2 billion user sessions in e-commerce websites. As you can imagine, we can find a seemingly never-ending supply of rich information with this sample, but today we will focus on two key topics for this discussion. First, we'll talk about data leakage and how data shows both known and unknown third parties actively accessing data they shouldn't, sometimes even accessing PII records. Then we will explore the topic of customer hijacking, which is quite prevailing in e-commerce websites, specifically through browser extensions, malware, and adware. In each case, we will focus on the business implications of these incidents and these threats, so that we can finally understand how organizations can take action to reduce their overall exposure to these cyber attacks. But just before I dive into the actual data, I want just to clarify that the data we will be showing today refers to the threats that were detected and blocked by the client-side security technology provided by JScrambler. Since our technology is configured to detect and block all client-side threats, we can safely assume that these numbers represent all attempted client-side attacks during these 2 billion user sessions. Now, starting with data leakage, our data shows the over 140,000 attempts data leaks. So each of these represent a data record that the third party tried to access when it shouldn't have access to it. Zooming into this data, we find 9,000 attempts leaks of PIR records, which were triggered by a variety of different third parties, most of which were previously unknown to the company. If we take into account the average cost of a leaked PIR record of $180, as stated by a recent report by IBM, we can estimate that this corresponds to about $1.6 million in savings that preventing the PII leaks. Of course, this is somewhat of a simplification, since the actual cost of PII may vary depending on the type of data, along with several other factors, but this is a fairly conservative estimation of how much this can represent to the business. One specific example of PII leaks that are prevalent in e-commerce is Mage Cart web skimming, which is pictured here on the left side. This refers to attacks that leak credit card information whenever users input it into a payment form on the website. Thousands of companies have already fallen victim of these attacks, and they are taking 22 days on average to detect the attack itself. During this time frame, the data of every single user that makes the purchase is leaked. And we actually placed a news clipping here of a very recent attack where threat actors specifically used a video player to inject the malicious code into 100 different websites at once. So this type of supply chain attack is actively happening in the wild right now. To really understand the depth behind this data, it's crucial to look at exactly what triggered these data leaks. And what we find is that there are several different third parties running on the website that are completely unknown to the security team. This can happen both because other teams are adding the scripts without any awareness of the security team, and because third-party scripts can actually add fourth-party scripts to the website. This is the perfect illustration of security risks that come from the complex supply chains behind e-commerce websites. And because these supply chains are constantly changing, even if you do regular pen testing, that only gives you a picture in time and can't include all the dynamic changes that are constantly happening. But it's not only known scripts that are the cause for concern, of course. When we were analyzing the scripts that triggered these thousands of attempt data leaks, we found that some of the scripts that the security team knew were running on their website and that were supposedly to be trustworthy were actually accessing way more data than it should. One example of this was an analytics service which had an agreement that specifically they should have access only to a certain amount of data, when it actually was accessing other types of records, essentially breaking the data handling agreements. In this specific example, the service was trying to access credit card information without consent from the company, and it would have succeeded if JScrambler wasn't blocking these attempts. This all gained even more proportion a couple of weeks later, after the fact was observed, when the company that provided the analytical service announced a huge data breach. If the credit card access was not blocked, it would be quite likely that they would have been part of that data breach. And to highlight how even seemingly trustworthy scripts can pose a security risk, we had some cases where first-party scripts, so the code was actually written internally by the company itself, were found to be behaving in a very strange way. When we tracked this code down, we found that it was actually legacy code that was poorly managed and was potentially posing a security risk. So this is more common than it might seem, but companies sometimes have the code developed many years ago before, so it's very hard to keep up with what the actual code is doing and how it is behaving on the client side of a website. But well, the common denominator in these cases is that by default, there's nothing stopping a piece of website code from accessing and leaking sensitive data. And the short and simple answer to most of these instances is that this data access should be blocked by default using a proactive approach. This goes hand in hand with the security recommendations to reduce the overall risk, namely with the Executive Order of the United States, which clearly states that organizations must ensure the integrity of the code and maintain trusted source code supply chains. Now moving to some of other key findings that we found, I want to talk a bit about customer hijacking. And customer hijacking refers to the intended disruption of the customer journey, often with the goal of leading the customer away from the website that they were actually browsing. I have this example here on the left, which basically shows us a browser extension that is displaying an overlay of a product page that says that the user can find the exact same product, but cheaper in a different website. This is a clear-cut example of a price comparison tool, which is pretty common these days. We all use it on our websites, on our browsers. But it's not just price comparison tools that can dramatically change how the website is displayed to the end user. There's also the case of adware and malware that might be infecting the devices of some customers and show similar pop-ups, sometimes leading them to phishing or scam websites. Our data shows precisely that these hijacking attempts are quite common, as we detected and blocked over 1.4 million of these attempts. And the risk associated with this threat is mostly to the actual business. So every single hijacking attempt has the potential of leading the user away of the website to a competitor website. Estimating how this can harm the business is hard. It's not easy to measure, and there's a lot of margin for error. But if we throw in some industry averages, we get a fairly conservative figure of just under $3 million in revenue that would otherwise been lost. Again, I will dive a bit deeper into this data and to explore some specifics of these hijacking attempts. First, our estimate points out that about 3% of all user sessions suffer some type of hijacking attempts. But this figure can vary significantly, and we have seen fluctuations in the data that can even go up to 5%. Our data also confirms that most of these hijacking attempts originate from browser extensions and user-installed tools, with malware and adware being a bit more residual in our sample. These tools are designed for a very specific usage, so it's not surprising that they mostly affect the product pages and the checkout page, which means that they are able to intercept the customer journey at critical moments and increase the likelihood of convincing the customer to abandon the website. Well, customer hijacking is often one of those cases where the actual damages to the companies are very easy to understand. The straightforward solution here is to make sure that every single hijacking attempt is blocked, which ends up directly recovering an important chunk of revenue that would otherwise be lost. Okay, so at this stage, we have a somewhat clear picture of the impact of client-side attacks and how companies can deal with them. But as Don presented earlier, we are seeing an increase in data breaches and attacks targeting e-commerce companies. And this leads me to two factors that might explain why the adoption of client-side security technology is still slow. In our experience working with several companies in this space, it's clear that two of the main deterrents are performance concerns and the required maintenance. In terms of performance, some of the security vendors have a very significant impact on performance, depending on the strategy they use and what they use to block these threats that are happening at the browser level. Of course, this makes it almost impossible for some organizations to justify implementing this technology due to the huge impact they would have on the user usage of their websites. And because we have been aware of this since the early stages, our development team, we have make it a hard requirement to ensure that the performance impact is essentially negligible, which is the feedback we happily are receiving from our customers. But then there's, of course, also the matter of maintenance. This is another area where things can get pretty complicated for security teams. If the company has to hire new people or extensively train their teams to be able to use the product, this quickly becomes a barrier to adoption. So the technology provided by most vendors in this space generates so many false positives and noise that it becomes nearly impossible to actually filter out the relevant data and act on mitigating actual threats. This is why instead of just delivering a product to our customers, we are delivering a complete solution where we guarantee a seamless deployment and actively configure the product to each specific customer. This means that we are essentially acting as an extension of our customer security team in analyzing the data and fine-tuning the product to make sure that they are detecting and blocking all client security threats in a timely manner. And speaking of customers, there are two specific cases I would like to quickly highlight. The first one is from a retailer, which is actually one of the 5 largest apparel retailers in the world. As expected, they handle an enormous volume of data, and their main security challenge was to be able to proactively block PII leakage and customer hijacking attempts. Well, the results of implementing JScrambler in the e-commerce platform were spot on with their objectives. They are successfully detecting any type of malicious code injection with JScrambler, and they are using the block by default approach when it comes to PII, payment data, and hijacking attempts. But it's also meant that JScrambler bought a series of other valuable capabilities. One of the biggest ones was that the customer was able to get 100% of website asset visibility thanks to our website inventory technology. They have a continuous visibility in every single script that is actually running on their user sessions. This was very crucial for them to act on real time to any unexpected behavior, such as the case when one of their vendors started to access more data than they were supposed to, as I mentioned before on the example. And even in particular critical scenarios, such as the case of Black Fridays, where we were ticking around 1 million detections per day, JScrambler did not harm the website performance. Okay, the other example I brought you today is the success story of a major airline that came to us with the main goal of preventing Mage card attacks and making sure that they wouldn't be breached like British Airways was in 2018. Here, they wanted to know if any of their scripts change behavior and to have the ability to prevent any web skimming attempts in real time. Because their website handles such a large volume of traffic, a key requirement was to make sure that they were only looking at real threats and no noise. They implemented JScrambler successfully, and they are using our technology to detect and mitigate any type of web skimmer. One of the key ingredients to achieve this is that they are using our web skimmer classification system coupled with our flexible rules engine, which enables them to prevent the leak without hurting the user experience. They are using some of our features, such as the website inventory, to get a clear picture of their web platform in real time, and our dashboards allow them to investigate any malicious behavior with a lot of detail. We transitioned from a POC to a production environment without any hiccups, and they specifically mentioned the value of being able to easily integrate the solution with no impact, which is great. As a result of the increased visibility that our clients now have over client-side scripts, the overall feedback we are getting is that they are now much more in control in regards to everything that happens on the client side. There's a high impact on security awareness from day one. The website inventory also allows them to improve how they handled some of the internal processes like onboarding new marketing scripts. And finally, when it comes to regulations, the feedback we have received is that because now they have much more visibility and control, it's much easier for them to demonstrate, for example, PCI compliance and even compliance with data regulations like GDPR and CCPA. Well, we are getting close to the end of our presentation here, so I will move things back to Don so you can give us some final insights and remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Felipe. Before I move over to the final remarks, I just want to quickly mention that everything we discussed today comes from a single first step. This is precisely what this slide here demonstrates. The first step in this path to preventing client-side attacks that is always gaining visibility on all website assets and any signs of malicious data that originates from them. This website inventory Felipe mentioned a couple of times before. What we do is we simulate a consumer session in your website using our detection technology, which allows us to gather and analyze a vast amount of data. Things like a snapshot of all the scripts running on the website, the types of data that they access, and also how are they interacting with that data. It's broken down into a high-level report with some key statistics like you see in the image here, and then a full-length analysis of all of the detections that can pose a security threat. This is all done on our end and doesn't have any impact whatsoever on the actual website. Now, I just want to wrap up some things with some final thoughts. There's a massive growth happening right now in e-commerce, and while this is generally good for business, it also attracts criminals, cyber criminals. One of the main security risks of e-commerce sites comes from the fact that they are powered by a mashup of third-party code, very complex supply chain, and it only takes one compromise to one third-party component to trigger a data breach. We have seen firsthand data collected by JScrambler while monitoring and protecting 2 billion e-commerce consumer sessions, which shows that any piece of website code can be used to leak data in PII, and that data hijacking can have a direct hit on revenue. The bottom line is that preventing these client-side attacks can lead to significant savings, both in preventing PII leaks and in terms of recovering lost revenue. Like I mentioned, first step is to improve the overall security posture is gaining visibility, line of sight with the website inventory. All right, we're running out of time right now. For today. Thank you very much for taking your time out of your day. We're going to be wrapping up. I want to remind you that you'll receive an email with our latest report, which provides an overview of the topic that we discussed today. Thanks everyone out there for joining us today, and we'll see you on the next one.
Bye bye.